Welcome to this A-level and IB revision session on specialisation and trade. So we're going to be looking at a couple of economists, Adam Smith and Ricardo, and comparative and absolute advantages. So what is specialisation and what are the key important takeaways? Well, countries will usually specialise in and export products which use intensely the factor inputs which they are most abundantly endowed. The key economists we need to know in this area for your exams are Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and we'll talk more about those in a minute. Countries can have absolute or comparative advantage over other countries in the production of their products, and we'll look at the definition of those in a minute. And specialisation and trade should lead to a better allocation of global resources. This is the key takeaway from this subject. So what is absolute advantage? Well, it was introduced in 1776 by an economist called Adam Smith, who you should all know about. And this is the ability of a country to produce more of a good or service using the same or fewer resources. What that means is that you can produce a good or service more efficiently than another country. So if we look at the table here, we're making cars and tractors, and it's UK and France I've used as my examples. So the table shows us the output using all available resources. Just be very careful in exams here, because sometimes they can give you a table showing the unit cost or the amount of hours it takes to produce a car or a tractor. But this table here shows us what our output is. And if you are given the cost in terms of hours of labour, etc., you need to calculate a table of output first before you can then calculate the opportunity cost in the next example for comparative advantage. So just be careful there. But for absolute advantage, we need to see who is making more of the good or service, given that they've both got the same amount of resources here. So the UK is making 10 cars, whereas France is making 12 cars. And in this example, if they've both got, say, 100 hours that they're available to them to produce, then France would have absolute advantage. For tractors, on the other hand, UK can make 20, France can make 36. Again, France can make more tractors using the same resources as the UK, assuming they've got the same amount of resources available to them. And so 36 is greater than 20, therefore France again has absolute advantage in tractors. So, comparative advantage then came along in 1821 thanks to David Ricardo. Really important to mention the economist in your exam answers. Just shows the examiner and the marker you know what you're talking about and that little extra depth of knowledge. The definition is that it's the ability of a country to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than another country. So if we then revert back to our original example of the UK output of 10 cars or 20 tractors and the France output of 12 or 36, we can calculate opportunity cost by dividing across the table. So if we decide to make one car in the UK, how many tractors are we giving up? Well, 10 cars was worth 20 tractors, so one must be worth 2 tractors. So that means the opportunity cost is 2 tractors when we're looking at cars. For tractors in the UK, it's the reverse. If we decide to make one tractor, we're giving up half as many cars, aren't we? Because 10 is half of 20, so the opportunity cost is 0.5 cars. For France, the opportunity cost, you can see, is 36 divided by 12 gives us 3 tractors, but then the opportunity cost of making one tractor is a third of a car, so 0.33. Who should specialise in cars? That's the question you would be asked in an exam. Well, the lower opportunity cost there is the UK, so because it's 2 tractors instead of 3 tractors, but then France should specialise due to their comparative advantage in tractors because theirs is 0.33, which is lower than 0.5. So I've just highlighted that there on the slide. Those 2 countries have the comparative advantage in those different products. I would actually circle these in your exam answer just to show that you know which one's which and just to remind yourself. You can show comparative advantage and absolute advantage using graphs and using PPCs. So in this example, I've put cars on the y-axis and tractors on the x-axis. You can see that France could make 12 cars and 36 tractors, and then you draw a straight line between the two. And for the UK, we know it was 10 and 20, and again, straight line between the two. There's a few things to note from this. The lines do not cross, these PPCs do not cross, because France has absolute advantage in both products. If the UK had absolute advantage in one of them, then obviously the lines would cross, but they don't. The gradient of the curve, it's also important to note for real top-end candidates here, the gradient of the curve reflects the opportunity cost, and thus the comparative advantage in the y-axis is shown by the steeper curve. So you can see that the UK, as we knew from our previous table, has comparative advantage in cars, and that is shown on the diagram because the UK has the steeper curve. France has a shallower curve, and you can see there that from our previous table, France had comparative advantage in tractors, and because it's got the shallower curve, we can see it again graphically. If you're puzzled in an exam with the math side of things and can't remember which way to divide across the table, just draw a simple diagram like this, and then remember that the steeper the curve will be the comparative advantage in the y-axis, and the shallower the curve will be comparative advantage in the x-axis. Then we've got to think about the criticisms of comparative advantage, and as we've seen in lessons, it is actually quite an unrealistic model. You see that there's an unrealistic two-country, two-product model which Ricardo came up with, where that's just not realistic. There are hundreds of countries in the world, there's millions and millions of products in the world that we trade, and so to barter two goods between two countries, it's just not realistic. We don't even barter goods, do we? We actually sell goods for currency, and the exchange rate would have to therefore come into play, which would affect things. You also got to think about the fact that it forgets transport costs. It costs a lot of money to move things around the world. Even in container ships, which are relatively cheap these days, to rent a container, it's still going to cost money on top of this model. And so to say that France should specialise in tractors and we should import them, it forgets the fact we're going to have to pay to transport those tractors to the UK. It also therefore forgets the environment, because it forgets the fact that these big cargo ships emit diesel, or use diesel, sorry, and emit fumes from that, and it's going to pollute the environment. And so that's a major issue that it forgets. It also assumes that factors of production such as labour are immobile internationally, which they're not. We know that people can move around and work. Thinking of examples of that, you look at the Schengen zone within the EU. People can move around within the EU and the Schengen zone to work in different countries very easily. We can even move relatively easily around the world. Friends of mine have moved off to Australia to work, have moved off to the United States to work, moved to Dubai to go and teach economics. There are many possibilities. Labour can move around the world much more freely and easily these days than it used to be able to, and this model forgets that. It also assumes free trade. We've seen in our studies on protectionism that free trade very rarely occurs. You've got Hong Kong as one example of a free trade country, but there are so many barriers to trade around the world due to protectionism that makes this an unrealistic assumption of comparative advantage. And it also forgets that if you specialise, you're going to kill off an industry. And so with our cars and tractors example that we were looking at earlier, if UK did specialise in cars and we're relied on France to make our tractors, what's going to happen to all of that workforce that were making tractors in the UK? They're all going to be made redundant and have to retrain into other industries. And then within France, structural unemployment in the car manufacturing industry would happen, and you'd have to have the car manufacturing employees retrain into other industries, and that costs money and it takes time because of that structural unemployment. It's a very expensive form of unemployment to get rid of, and it takes a long while. Examples of that from history, think of Thatcher closing the coal mines in the UK and relying on imports of coal. There were lots of miners. It's created inequality within the UK because of that. So that's a really good example of structural unemployment being caused by relying on imports and allowing our country to become dependent on another country for our imports of coal. Okay, so that's it for specialisation and trade. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, hope it's helped, but come back next time. We'll be revising on our patterns of trade and our tariffs, quotas and subsidies for protectionism. I'll be making videos on those. See you next time.